Hello everyone and welcome to lesson 3 in the Art of Wedding Photography course. You are here with myself, Caroline Callahan, and the course is brought to you by Shaw Academy. Okay, so guys, before we move forward into our lesson, I do just want to give you a quick recap on lesson 2. So in lesson 2, we took a look at a location scouting and we talked about the benefits of doing one of those, as well as an engagement shoot. Again, talking about the practicalities of doing that, along with looking at a few different examples to give you a few ideas. And then we talked quite a bit about the pre-wedding organisation or the pre-wedding planning that you as a wedding photographer should really be doing. And then we finished up by looking at the benefits of having a second photographer along with you on the day would be. And I hope you're all really excited about today's lesson because we're going to take a look at the actual wedding day itself. And that means we're going to start looking at what photos you should be taking on the day. Now we will start with a quick look at some camera basics, but we'll very quickly move on and start looking at shots from the morning. Now we're literally going to take examples of each of the different type of shots you should be taking, and we'll discuss the different aspects of them. So it could be anything from compositional techniques, lighting, lens types, and so on. We will analyse the images in such a way that hopefully you will feel confident about not only what you need to be taking, but also will have a few ideas of how you could take them. And we'll also be doing the same with detail shots. So I will be bringing these up throughout each section of the day that we will be looking at, but I do think they're an important enough aspect that I wanted to talk specifically about them too. And as always, before we start into this, I'd just like to quickly talk about why we would look at these particular subjects and how they fit into your photography education. Well, I know plenty of photographers that may only begin photographing a wedding day at the wedding ceremony itself, and they might move on from there. And obviously that is an incredibly important part of the day. But personally, I think the morning is a fantastic part of the day. It really is when all the excitement and the emotions, they're building up, and the families, they're buzzing around the couple. And it can be really, really busy, it can be hectic, but it is such an amazing photo opportunity. But throughout this course, you are going to hear me talk about how you're telling the story of the day. And honestly, every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the morning is the beginning of the day for the wedding couple, so ideally you should be there to capture that. Equally, the detail shots you should be taking throughout the day, they all add to the story. And remember, most couples, they are customizing an awful lot of the day. So all of these details like the jewelry, the booklets, cake, all of that they've chosen and may well have even made by the couple themselves. All of this adds a descriptive element to the story. And again, learning about all of this is just adding to your photography knowledge and your skills. And all of that is going to help your day run smoother, which is my biggest aim for all of you guys. Okay, look, I'm going to deviate just a little bit very, very quickly because I want to talk about a few camera basics and more so their visual effects. Now, it's not something that I'm going to be going into too much detail on because we do have a whole foundation photography course that covers all of this, and we also have an advanced level photography course that expands on all of it. But I just want to point out a few things. Now, I want you to have a think for yourself. How familiar are you really with what your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO do to an image? I just mean visually, like what effect do each of these have on your images? Now, hopefully you do have an understanding on the difference it makes to your exposure, but I just want to explain the differences and the impact it will have visually on your image as well, because this is really how we can begin to be creative with our photography. So the first one I'm going to talk about is shutter speed. And shutter speed, it controls or it captures motion or action in your images. So a slow shutter speed will create a blur in your image. Now hopefully you can see, I know it's not a big diagram, but I do think it illustrates the point quite easily. But hopefully you can see there's a little bit of blur here on Uncle Fuggles, okay? And that is due to a slower shutter speed. Now ideally, if you're photographing people at a wedding or even portraiture, even if you are using a tripod, you're still not going to want to have a shutter speed of anything slower than 1/60th of a second, okay? If you do, you're going to pick up motion from the people themselves. Even if you have a tripod, they're still going to move within the image, and that motion will be picked up and it can result in a blurry photograph. Now, on the other hand, if there's an awful lot of movement going on and you do know that you want to freeze that motion, you're going to want to use a faster shutter speed, okay? And especially if you're using a longer lens, which is heavier, you will also want to use a faster shutter speed again, okay? Now, a general rule with your shutter speeds is to match your shutter speed to the focal length of your lens. For example, if you're using a 200mm lens, you'll be shooting at least 1/200th of a second, okay? And the reason for that is that it's going to avoid camera shake. The bigger those lenses, the heavier they tend to be, and therefore you're going to pick up a bit of camera shake. Now, if you're using an even longer lens, like a 300mm lens, you're going to want to be shooting at least 1/300th of a second. I say at least, it is safer to go a little bit faster, but it is just a general rule of thumb to keep in mind. But look, if you're photographing people that are running, if they're walking, again, even if you're just using a 50mm lens, you will still want to go at a slightly faster shutter speed, maybe of at least 250. At the very minimum, that's with a 50mm lens. But like I say, always keep an eye on what your focal length is. But all right, look, just to quickly move on, just to talk a little bit about your aperture. So your aperture, this basically, as well as influencing your exposure, it also has an effect on how much of your image is in focus. And you'll hear this referred to as a depth of field, okay? So when you're using an aperture like f2.8, you're going to have a shallow depth of field. And that basically means not very much of your image is in focus, okay? Whereas if you're aiming for a deep depth of field, if you want a lot of your image to be in focus, you'll be using an aperture like f16 or f22, okay? And that basically means more of your image will be in focus. So it's very important to keep these in mind. They can be used quite creatively, but then you also have to keep in mind if you're photographing large groups of people and you want to make sure everybody's in focus, well then you're going to need to be using a medium aperture like f8 or f11 as a minimum, okay? So you can be confident the entire group are in focus. But just to reiterate that point, a shallow depth of field, it basically means not very much of your image will be in focus. So you choose your focus point. We'll say, for example, it's on Uncle Fuggles' eye. And if you shoot that with an f2.8, not very much else will be in focus. So we can see the background is quite a blur behind him there. Whereas if you go the other end of the scale and you're photographing at f16, f22, you might even have the option of f32 depending on your lens. And with that, you will achieve a deep depth of field, meaning much more of your image will be in focus. So not just where you focus on, but much more of the entire shot will be in focus. And lastly, you will also have to consider the effects of your ISO. So your ISO basically is how sensitive your sensor is to the light. So how quickly it reacts to the light. But this also affects noise in your image. Noise or grain, you might hear it referred to quite often as well, okay? And so you will hear, images will be referred to as being very grainy or very noisy, and this is the effect of a high ISO. So something like about maybe 1600 or 3200 will be kind of generally considered a high ISO. And very often this will allow you to get a correct exposure in very low light situations. But like everything else, it does have its visual implications as well. So using a lower ISO, like ISO 100 or 200, will give you much more clarity in the images, okay? So personally, for weddings anyway in portraiture, my preference is to aim to go for as low an ISO as is possible. Now, like I say, very often you could be in very low light situations. So particularly when we're talking about maybe doing weddings in a church, we'll see examples throughout the course where you can see that there's a high ISO, and it's just because otherwise the image would have been completely underexposed. Okay, so there is trade-offs to everything, and very often, unfortunately, you won't always get to use the exact settings that you might like to use, but if you at least have an understanding of the visual implications of your choice, you shouldn't have too many surprises with how your images turn out. Now, I know I'm absolutely speeding through this, guys. This here is just called an exposure triangle. You can easily Google this exposure triangle and you'll get a similar enough diagram, which I do recommend you downloading just for a visual reference. However, like I say, all of this is covered quite extensively in our Foundation in Photography course, or our Diploma in Photography course. If this is all very, very new to you, well then I definitely recommend taking a look at that. Okay, so let's start looking at how you might approach the day itself. So before we start looking at the images of the morning, I do want to run through a few tips that I do think you will find quite handy. And firstly, I will say be early. So give yourselves time to just chill out for a few minutes before you go in and start photographing. Now, at this point, you could have easily got stressed out with traffic, or you could have got lost on your way, but all of that is just not important right now. Just relax and recompose yourself. This might sound really, really silly, but take a minute to have a little snack. Remember, you absolutely need to keep those energy levels up throughout the day, so don't forget to eat and drink any chance that you get. I'll always have a little selection of food that's quite easy to just nibble on throughout the day whenever I might get a quiet moment. And honestly, I know it might sound like quite silly basic advice, but it's very, very easy to forget to just stop for a moment and look after yourself, because the day can be incredibly busy. Take a few minutes to just review your shot list. Is there anything unusual on it that's been requested by the couple? Check all of the settings on your camera. So make sure that you don't have your ISO up really high from your last shoot. Make sure that you are photographing in RAW. Make sure all your memory cards have been cleared and formatted. Though in all honesty, I really would recommend you've done all of this the night before, but at the very least you do it now before you walk in and start your job. And definitely make sure there's a memory card in your camera to start, okay? Definitely don't want to get caught out on that. If you are shooting with a second photographer, make sure they've done all of the same things and synchronize the time on your cameras now, okay? I talked about this already. You basically set the time on your two different cameras at the exact same time, okay? And that is basically going to help you quite a bit later on when you're importing all the images into Photoshop, Lightroom, or whatever other software you're using. It basically means you can arrange all the photographs by the date and the time taken, meaning they're going to be arranged chronologically, making it very, very much that bit easier when you're editing. Just make sure to make all of this little routine a habit for yourself from the beginning. Okay, so now you have arrived, and we're going to start looking at the morning itself and how you might approach all of this. Well, when you first walk in, I would always say to you, have your camera ready to go. You don't know what you're about to just walk into, so just in case, they could be about to open a bottle of champagne or something like that, just be ready. However, I would say to you, if nothing particularly special is actually going on, I'd prefer to take a few moments to just check in on the bride or the groom, try introduce myself to as many of the bridal party or family as possible. And I'm always looking out for the best locations for photos as well. So I'm looking for light sources, big windows or doorways which let in a lot of light. Do you need to turn on any of the lights in the room, or do you need to open any curtains? And it might look bright enough to the eye, but do a few readings with your camera and see what that is saying. Also, do you need to tidy anything away? It could be anything at all now, but just look at what's going to be in the background of your shots. And if you do find there's a lot of stuff that's very distracting or quite ugly, try and clear them away. Now, I'd still say do it kind of subtly enough. You don't want to be insulting anybody or making anybody kind of feeling self-conscious. So just do it kind of subtly enough, and maybe make sure that you're not putting away anything that's actually quite important that they will be looking for later on. But about maybe 7 out of 8 times out of 10, I would be starting to photograph with the groom. So this is where we're going to start looking at today. And at this point in the morning, there's so much banter and so much fun. And photographing this, it's always a great way to get into the day. And it lets everybody get used to you being there without the posing and directions. And here you can see nobody's really paying attention to the photographer. You're really just kind of capturing the mood and the atmosphere of the morning. So, in this image, everyone's getting ready, but you can see they're having a laugh, and, they're just kind of going through that last minute kind of preparation. And this particular shot was taken with a 50mm lens. So you can see nice big windows letting in lots of light. But if you ever feel like you'd need to turn on more lights, turn on any lamps or lights that are in the room, or pull back the curtains, whatever you need to make sure you're getting a good exposure. But remember as well, when you're photographing people, you don't want to have a shutter speed any slower than 1/60th of a second, okay? Now personally, if I can go a bit faster, I would feel more comfortable with that. So I'd much prefer to have it at about 1/25th of a second, or even 1/200th of a second if I can, just to be sure. But you're also kind of considering your ISO. Now I'd try and keep mine at about 100, maybe up to 400 ISO. Now it will definitely depend on your own cameras, how well they do handle ISO. Some of the more modern cameras, you can actually go up quite high, like it might be about 1600, 3200 before you start to see noise. But then there is other cameras where you might start to notice that at about maybe 400, 800 ISO, okay? So it's just being aware of your own camera's capabilities. Now, I would still say to you, if using a higher ISO means that you get an exposure in a very low light situation, well then it's absolutely fine, okay? I will still use it, but I'm aiming to keep the clarity as much as possible. And then lastly, that leaves you with your aperture, okay? So if you want to have everything in focus, well then try to use an aperture of maybe about f8, f11, probably even up to f22 for those kind of much bigger scenes. Now in this particular case, okay, we can see we've got those nice big windows letting in quite a bit of light. So the shutter speed would have been about 1/25th of a second, the aperture was 5.6, and the ISO 200, okay? And been a nice bright room. There wasn't any need for flash. Now you also need to watch out for the detail shots. So, get shots as the groom or the groomsmen, they're putting the flowers in the buttonholes. Something like the cufflinks can be very personalized, so make sure to get those as well. I know very often you might start noticing when you're shooting details, you might use a wide open aperture. Now in this case it was f2.8, And that just means the focus is on the detail like the flowers here, but everything else is starting to get soft very, very quickly, okay? So we can see his arms, they're kind of getting blurred out, even though there's not a huge amount of distance between the main focus point, which is the flower, okay? So everything gets soft nice and quickly with that f2.8. Now because there was a window quite nearby, the shutter speed's relatively fast. It's 1/500th of a second, and a low ISO of 200. You will also need to be looking out for all the different preparation or the different kind of hanging around that's going on, okay? And I always think something like this is a fantastic, quite a natural shot of the groom. You know, he is ready, but he's still kind of making sure everything else is going to plan, or maybe he's just keeping an eye on the time or checking over his speech, okay? So whatever it is, always watch out for these little moments, okay? And you can see he's not particularly paying any attention to the photographer. So in this shot, he is nearly kind of having a moment alone, just preparing for the day ahead. And do remember, you're not just documenting the day, you are trying to tell a story. So just think about the bride, you know, when she gets to see these type of shots, she'd absolutely love them. Now, in terms of how the image was taken, I want you to take a bit of a guess. Do you think this was taken on a shallow depth of field or a deep depth of field? So just have a guess, have a think, and look for any little hints in the image. It has been taken with a shallow depth of field, okay? So it would have been an aperture of about 2.8, f2.8, to achieve this type of look. Again, you can see the curtains to the front are blurred out, and again behind him is all blurred out. Even his kind of arm going off to this side is getting blurred out. So very much a shallow depth of field when you see that much of the image is blurred, okay? And you definitely need to take the opportunity to get a few more formal shots as well. Now, I would definitely say you need to get the groom on his own once he is ready. But keep an eye out for a few different details. You know, has he got his tie or his bow tie done correctly? The flower, you know, if he has one, is it in his buttonhole? Cufflinks are on. Do remember to watch out for all those little details, because your clients will notice them later on. And again, even though with these shots you will be setting them up, they can still have a relatively relaxed feeling to them, you know. In this shot we can see the groom, he's got his hands in his pockets, and it just kind of takes the formality out of the image or the pose, and he's just kind of looking off into the distance. Now in this case, you know, he does have his his jacket kind of buttoned up. But if you want to just kind of give it a little bit more of an informal feel, maybe just get him to open the jacket up, and again keep the hands in the pockets, and it just kind of helps start to create that informal feel. Definitely take the opportunity to get some group shots as well. Absolutely with the groomsmen, but I'd also say with any family members. Now, I generally try and get the groom with his best man individually, and definitely with his parents. But if he does have any brothers or sisters, again, I'll try and get shots of him with these. And they can be as formal or informal as you like. I like to kind of set them up in such a way where you can see everybody clearly. You know, again, just kind of showing off their suits, but I do still like them to have a relatively relaxed feeling to them. And something like this can work really, really well. So, you know, they've been set up, but just by saying something like, "Oh, any last words of advice, lads?" and you'll very easily find you'll get a little reaction like this, or even just asking the groom, "Oh, how are the nerves coming on?" You know, anything at all. Just kind of have a bit of joke and have a bit of banter, and certainly encourage the groomsmen to do likewise. Now again, if you do have the opportunity or the time to maybe go outside with them, there generally will be more light once you're outdoors, and that's always great. But it does always let you put them into the setting as well. Now when I'm doing the group shots, I don't like to have that really shallow depth of field that we've seen in the previous images. And it's basically just because I want to be sure everybody's going to be in focus. So not just the groom. So in a case like this, I'd be aiming to have my aperture at maybe f8, maybe even f11 if I can. Now you don't necessarily have to go to f22 because they are actually all lined up more or less, the same distance from the camera. So they should technically all be in focus. And again, guys, I want you to try and remember what is a minimum shutter speed you should be using when photographing people. I want you to have a think for yourself. What do you think should be the minimum shutter speed you should be using? Okay, so I hope you're all answering at least 1/60th of a second, okay? Now, if you can go even faster, again, that is even better. But 1/60th of a second is the absolute slowest I will use when photographing people. But like I say, if there is enough light, I'm much more comfortable using at least 1/25th of a second or even faster again. Anything slower than 1/60th of a second is going to just pick up the movement from the people and will also notice camera shake, especially from somebody like myself. I don't have the steadiest of hands, okay? And look, even if you're using a tripod, you still shouldn't go any slower than 1/60th of a second. But look, in terms of the ISO, this one was taken outdoors, so again, plenty of daylight there. So in this situation, you probably will get away with using an ISO like 100 or 200. And that certainly would be my preference to avoid getting any noise or grain in an image like this. And don't forget any kids, okay? So, do ask, and if it's any nieces or nephews or certainly any of their own kids, people do love to see shots of the bride or groom with them, okay? If there's any page boys or flower girls, well then I would consider it kind of mandatory and it would be considered a must, I guess then. Now, I would say to you, photographing children, it can be quite hard, especially if they are very young. Sometimes you might need to kind of have a little bit of a chat with them beforehand. Nothing to do with photography or the fact that they're about to be photographed, just something that helps them relate to you. So whether or not you're even just complimenting them on their outfit or their shoes or asking them what are they most excited about, whatever it is at all. But anything that helps them relate to you and nearly forget about the photographs. But do try and keep the photos quick, okay? Now, especially so early on in the day, you really don't want the kids getting sick of being photographed before you've even kind of got to the official family shots. Do remember, it can be quite a long day for the little ones. Now, we'll move on and I want to start talking about the morning shots with the bride. Now, you may not have the time or the couple may not want you to necessarily go to the grooms to get all the shots that we've just been talking about, but I would say at least 90% of weddings, probably higher to be quite honest, I would be going to the bride's house and getting shots of her as she's getting ready. So you start with a very similar approach. So you're looking at all the preparation work that's been done. So, look out for shots of the bride as she's getting her hair and makeup done. The exact same for the bridesmaids as well. So try and get the candid shots as well. Are the girls sitting around drinking champagne? Are they fixing each other's hair? Doing each other's nails? Whatever it is that's going on, guys, just capture it. And again, be aware that you need to Again, you need to be aware of the light as well. So watch for how you can add more ambient light into your images. So do you need to open curtains? Do you need to turn on lights? Are you happy to use flash? And if you are using flash, I would say I always think the most successful flash images are when the photographer has combined ambient light and fill flash. So that way the flash isn't kind of too dominant, or it's not the only thing illuminating. It's not the only light source illuminating the image. Now, if you do see there is a great big bright window over one side of the room, by all means feel free to ask the bride to maybe move over by that as well for some shots. Or if you even need to move some lamps around, whatever it is that helps you to get a better photograph. Don't forget the detail shots here as well. So, I mean, obviously, this is quite a striking example. We've got the henna on the hands. So, if there's anything like that, make sure to capture it. But beyond that, you should still be looking at her jewellery, maybe if she has a pretty hairpiece as she's putting on her shoes. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail on this for the moment because I will be doing a whole section on the detail shots later on. But certainly another lovely set of shots to get is once the bride is starting to get dressed. So at this point you're going to notice everybody around the bride, they're going to be helping her out. I think these are really, really nice shots to get because it does give a great sense of the day. And you're going to see the bridesmaids helping put on the veil, maybe mum helps her button up the dress, or get the bride as she's putting on her shoes. All of this type of stuff is worth capturing. And everybody certainly comments about the amazing levels of support that they received during the whole day and even the run up to the wedding. So these are nearly kind of your visual representations of that. Now this particular image has been taken with flash, so we can see the telltale signs of the flash there by the big shadow cast by the bunch of flowers, okay? Now it's absolutely fine if you do need to use flash, but I do also want to show you another example just to give you an idea of a few alternatives. So something like this, okay? If you decide not to use flash, and in this case, again, this is where not being afraid to direct where and how you want these things done can really, really help you create some beautiful photography. So just by saying to the bride, look, move over here by the window and put the veil on over here. It means you get a completely different feel to the image than what the previous image was. So in this case, this is actually backlit, and this can be, so we can see the main light source is coming from behind where you are photographing from. So it's coming from the other side of the bride. And then like an image, a backlit lighting like this, it's really quite a beautiful effect, and it's very different to what most people are used to seeing with photography. So don't be afraid to have the images a little bit dark sometimes. Remember, in this case, the image very much is all about the mood. So in this case, if you added flash in here, it would have a very different feel to it. And personally, in my opinion, I don't think it would work half as well. But certainly it's going to be down to personal preference and the look that you are trying to create. If you're not so confident with this method, you could still turn the flash on for a few shots, get a few safe ones where everything's illuminated, and then maybe you can turn the flash off and try get a few different looks. And at the end of the day, you can compare them side by side and see which one you do prefer. Now, once the bride is ready, you are going to see a huge outpouring of emotion. So do try and capture as much of this as possible. So in particular, watch out for the reactions of the bridesmaids, parents, especially the father of the bride. He's probably been kept out of the room for most of the morning. So for him, it's going to be the biggest shock. And just think, there's absolutely nothing that's going to make a man crumble as much as seeing his little girl kind of, all ready to go off and get married. And certainly I know a lot of photographers that would absolutely love this moment and would actually say it's one of their favourite moments to capture on the day. And I think a lot of people do tend to agree with it. It can be a very, very sweet one and definitely shows off all the emotion from the day. Once the bride is ready, I always try and get some shots of her on her own. So I always like to kind of start with some safe shots. So by safe shots, I mean, them just looking straight at the camera, smiling, happy, kind of pretty straightforward. But then I like to get these shots as well. So looking away, looking a bit more contemplative. If you need to bring her over by the window, by all means do that as well. And very often you'll find you get this beautiful kind of gorgeous modeling light effect from a window. And if there's net curtains, that can actually help diffuse the light that's coming in, meaning it's quite nice and soft, which is always going to be a bit more flattering for majority of people. And depending on the dress, you may need to concentrate on the back of the dress for a few shots. So, make sure to keep an eye out for the dress maybe being crumpled up or folded in the wrong place. If you need to kind of go in, if there's a big long train on the dress, sometimes you need to pick it up and kind of lay it out properly so you can actually see the train. Sometimes kind of you laying it out and then tell the bride to take a step forward, and it means it all falls into place quite beautifully. And again, a shot like this can be really, really popular. So it's just using the natural light that is coming in from the window to backlight the bride in quite honestly, it's quite a simple pose, really. She's just kind of opening the curtains, but she's doing it in a way that's nearly adding a little bit of drama to the shot. But it's certainly showing off the lovely shape of her waist and the dress, and certainly all the detail in the back of the dress is there as well. So another quite lovely shot to do. And do try, if you take a look at this image, you can see that it's quite symmetrical as well. So she's in the center of the window. We can see we've got the curtains and we've got the bit of the lamps on either side of her. So do try and think, do you make this image quite symmetrical, or do you maybe move to the side and get a side view or not? Do play around with your viewpoints, as this will make a big, big difference to your images as well. And it's certainly worthwhile getting some close-up shots too. So this can be looking directly at the camera, or something like what we see here. Again, a bit more contemplative, the bride having a moment to herself before the big moment. And if you do have the time and the weather is good, again, it's great to get a few shots outside as well. And you can see in this, you can get an idea, there is actually quite a lot going on in the background. But because it's been taken with a shallow depth of field, that background's not very distracting. So we're very much concentrating on the bride in this case. And you can see in this case, again, the bride is actually off to the side rather than being dead center for every single image. So again, just play around with your compositional techniques. This would be referred to as the rule of thirds, where the main subject is in 1/3 to the side of 1/3 of the photograph. And again, as with the groom, do try and get a few group shots done here as well. So get the entire bridal party and try and get the bride and maid of honour together. Again, I'd say the bride with her parents and the bride with any siblings. And if you have the time, or if you have a second photographer, I'd even try and get some individual shots of each bridesmaids once they're all dressed and their hair and makeup is complete. And remember, these are the VIPs of the day, so do try and get these extra shots if at all possible. Now with this particular setup, we can see the girls, they obviously have been set up in this way, but they've been told to get in kind of nice and close, and that's just helping to take away the formal feel from the shots. Like, they're a pretty happy group and they're obviously having quite a bit of fun. So do encourage them to get in nice and close, and again, just kind of, have fun with them, and you'll get beautiful reactions like this. And don't forget the flower girls. So I always like to get a shot of them with the bride, though if I can get a shot of them on their own, I will do that as well. Now again, you can see this setup is very, very simple. It's not overly posed. And remember, you do want to keep it quick and easy for the kids. If they're not really playing ball or don't want to be standing still, you can even just ask them all to walk towards you, and that can help you get a very, very easy shot. Okay, so I'm going to backtrack a little bit, guys. So we have kind of touched on this, but just wanted to give you a few more examples and emphasize the importance of the detail shots. So before I move on, I want to start showing you examples. I want to give you a few tips just in terms of what you do need to be considering. So an awful lot of this, to be honest, it's actually what you should be thinking of when you're creating any kind of image. But I do feel a lot of people just seem to think the detail shots that they're quick, easy documentations, and they actually miss an important opportunity to get some really beautiful creative shots. So like any photograph, you absolutely need to be considering your lighting. So, do you decide you want to use flash for these, or do you only want to have ambient lighting? As I said, for the morning shots, look for the best lighting around the room. And the great thing about these detail shots is, for the most part, you can move the particular objects really, really easily. So watch out for window lighting. Do you need to turn on any lights on in the room? But if you decide you are using flash, do you want to have direct flash lighting, or are you going to maybe bounce the flash off a ceiling instead? So bounce flash is literally when you turn the flash upwards. It can only be done with an external flashlight. You can turn it upwards so the light's pointing up towards the ceiling and bounces back down over your subject, and that creates quite a diffused type of lighting as well. Background is incredibly important, so it can either be very distracting or it can complement the object or the subject. Again, the great thing about these detail shots is you can very easily move them to get the background that you do want. So look out for one that either complements the subject or the object, or at the very least is not distracting. If it is distracting, maybe you get it out of the shot or you get it out of focus, okay? So maybe that's where you start using your shallow depth of field. And again, as in all of your photographs, you need to be thinking about how you want to arrange or compose the subjects. So, don't get caught out simply putting everything into the center of the shot. So play around with your rule of thirds or use other compositional features. So maybe the use of shapes or lines to create a kind of beautiful, interesting shot. Now also, in terms of arrangements, do you simply photograph the objects on their own, or do you want to arrange a number of them together? And you'll see some objects are arranged into beautiful still lives. So, can you incorporate other objects that tell a bit of a story about the couple? And you might find, a lot of details will actually already be arranged in a beautiful setup, especially once you make your way to the reception. And lastly, I do think it's worth making a conscious decision on what you want your depth of field to be like. So, with a lot of detail shots, you will see a shallow depth of field is very, very popular these days. And that happens when you use an aperture like f1.4 or 2.8, maybe even f4. And that basically means your object, or at least part of it, will be in focus, but the background will be all blurred out, creating that really beautiful effect where the viewer's eyes will be completely drawn to the particular object. Alright, so let's start looking at a few examples. And look, firstly, I would say to you, throughout the entire day, it's important to just stop and take a minute and think of the important details to this particular part of the day. So, in the morning, it's generally all the accessories like the shoes, the rings, jewelry, cufflinks, flowers, etc., etc. And like I say, it can be a lovely chance to get really creative with a few shots. So maybe mix in a few accessories together and arrange a few still life shots like these. Now be very aware of the background in these shots. You very much want the emphasis to be on the objects. As I said, it's very common to see these done with a wide open aperture like 2.8, and that gives us this shallow depth of field. But it also generally means you can avoid using flash too. Now you can see in the shot here with the rings, that the rings are in focus, but the flowers, even though there's not very much distance between them, they're already getting blurred out. And that's a perfect example of a really shallow depth of field, and that's what you would get when you're using an aperture like f2.8 or 1.4. Now, if I needed to use flash at this point, I'd actually prefer to maybe turn the flash so it's facing a wall or the ceiling, and then it bounces back onto your objects, and that's just going to give you a softer lighting on it, avoiding really, really harsh shadows. Remember, if you're doing detail shots like this, really you're going to be in very, very close, and that's, if you're using flash been that close, you're going to get really, really quite harsh, quite strong shadows being so close to the objects. Now again, this could be a big leap in terms of technical skills. So if you've never heard of bounce flash and you've never done it before, we do cover this in the advanced photography course, the ultimate photography program. So if you've never heard of that technique, it is covered there. So do take a look at that. And I'd absolutely consider a shot of the dress absolutely mandatory. So, if you're there before she's actually in the dress, try and get a shot of the dress as it's hanging up, okay? But don't forget to get in close and maybe get any close-up shots of the details on the dress too. You could get a really, really beautiful shot of that detail on the belt. Now, very often when you turn up, you will find it hanging on either a curtain pole or a wardrobe, and that can be a really great way to photograph them. Now, if you do need to move it, well then, no problem, just discuss this with them, let the bride know it's what you're going to do, but hopefully it goes without saying, absolutely handle the dress with care, okay? And if you need a bit of help, don't be afraid to ask anybody to help you hang it up somewhere else. And this is another example using a shallow depth of field. But the main reason I want to talk about this image is that it's actually ticking off the boxes in terms of getting detail shots. But the use of the guitar, and in particular the strings of the guitar, that just adds another great compositional element to the image. And it's literally drawing your eye straight to the rings. Or the fact that everything's blurred in front of and behind the ring means it's not distracting too much from the rings themselves. However, what I really like about this image is how personal it is to the couple. Not everybody's gonna be able to play guitar, and certainly won't have a guitar just lying around their house. So this is a result of getting to know the couple. If you know that they're into music, and especially if they play an instrument, do try and think about how you could incorporate this into a few of your shots. And as the day goes on, you're going to find that there's still lots and lots of details that the couple will have put a lot of effort into. So do watch out for these. And once you move on to the ceremony, look out for the booklets. Very often they could have been made by the couple. Pew flowers or any of the flower arrangements. Do they have confetti? If so, how are they presented? And obviously, this is quite a unique way to present the confetti with these little heart shapes. So very, very unique, therefore, I think well worth being captured. Don't forget the wedding car as well, okay? You should be obviously getting a full shot of this, probably with the bride and groom actually standing by it. But I do also try and get a detail shot of it as well, especially if it's a really kind of classic car. So maybe watch out for the features that the car is defined by. And I think it can be quite nice to put some of the detail shots into perspective. So, again, I'm getting a detail shot of the car, but in this case, we've got the church featured in the background as well, okay? Now, in this particular instance, I didn't want the church all blurred out because it is quite a beautiful enough feature in itself, especially with this archway over the door. And I've also used quite a wide angle lens just to give it quite a different look to all the normal detail shots that you will see. And very often there will be a very popular way to do a particular set of shots, but it is always great to mix it up and get variations so everything's not looking very similar. Here's an example of the pew flowers, but rather than just zooming in and getting the flowers on their own, instead, if you actually zoom out, just focus on the flowers, but then rearrange the composition so that you can actually include the bride and groom and blur them out in the distance. It's just another way to add variation to your shots. It's also putting the pew flowers into perspective in terms of the setting so that we can see where they fit into the day. And again, we can see the bride and the groom, they do obviously feature in the shot, but it's in a very different way to them being the primary focus. It's a similar idea here. So once you move on to the reception, you're going to want to look for all the beautiful decorative features. And once you get onto the reception venue, there can be any amount of details to get. So look out for the flower arrangements, favours, any decorations like the bunting, the candles and the lighting. Name cards, table plan, etc, okay? And if you do have a second shooter, a second photographer along with you, they could probably help you with this, so they could take the pressure off you and can leave you more time to spend on the family shots or the more formal shots with the couple. However, as I said when we talked about our organisation, make sure to ask the couple, is there any element to this that's really important to them? You still want to be taking all of these shots, but cover yourself by asking what's most important, just in case there's something a little bit different that you don't necessarily see. The cake is another huge one to get, so definitely don't miss out on that. Try and get it before the room fills up, and don't just get the complete cake, do zoom in to any decorative features as well. And don't forget to look at the table setups and the details that could be laid out. You know, the couple may have favours for their guests. They might have personalised the table places or the names. So again, all worth capturing. And definitely the menu and absolutely the flowers. The flowers are generally quite an expensive one. So like I say, if they're spending a lot of money, you really, really should be capturing any details like that. Well, all right, look, hopefully you can see how these would really add to the wedding album, or even just to your set of photographs, and why a couple would really, really want these shots. I think, again, you know, you really have to think of how you can add value to your work as a photographer, and I really think these detail shots can be a beautiful way to do that. That is it for lesson 3. So for now, as always, I'd like to just do a quick review of what we have gone over today. So we started with some camera basics, very, very quick insight into how they visually, the likes of your shutter speed, ISO and aperture, how they visually affect your images. And hopefully you're a little bit more familiar with some of the terminology like your depth of field and noise and motion. Certainly well worthwhile doing a bit more research or having a look at our foundation level photography course if all of that's completely new to you. We then moved on and we looked at the morning shots. Now, you may not always be asked to photograph this part of the day, but I certainly think that it's really, really well worthwhile trying to convince any clients to do this part, to have this part of the morning photographed. Heaps and heaps of emotion, and I think it's a lot of fun to photograph this part of the day. We then moved on and talked about the detail shots. So how these can add to your value as a photographer, and certainly we've looked at a number of different ways you can approach this. And throughout, quite a bit of image analysis there, so hopefully you will be able to go and recreate quite a few of these images. Our next step will be photographing the ceremony itself, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about that now. In lesson 4, we will look at the ceremony shots, so obviously a very important part of the day. So we'll look at some of the more important shots and how you might approach these. From there on in, we'll take a look at the type of shots that you could be doing with the wedding couple themselves. So this is really, really when you can get quite creative with your shots and try and wow the couple. And we will, of course, do more and more image analysis so you've got a better idea of how these images were made and therefore be able to recreate them yourself. Okay, so let me say thank you for attending lesson